The Forbidden Lesson. Chapter 1. The Routine of Life. I never thought my life would take such an unexpected turn. My name is Sara, and I've been married to my husband, David, for nearly 15 years. We have 2 children, Emma, who is 12, and Jake, who is 9. I'm a high school English teacher at a private school in our suburban town. To an outsider, my life would probably seem perfect, stable, predictable, comfortable. And for a long time, I believed it was. David and I met in college. He was studying engineering, and I was majoring in English literature. We were young, in love, and excited about our future together. David was, and still is, a wonderful man, reliable, hardworking, and kind. We built a life together, bought a house, had children, and settled into the routine of married life. But somewhere along the way, we lost something. The passion that once burned so brightly between us began to dim, and our relationship became more about the everyday tasks of running a household than about the love that had once drawn us together. I tried not to dwell on it. After all, I had a good life, a life many people would envy. But as the years went by, I found myself feeling increasingly restless. The spark between David and me had faded, replaced by a kind of comfortable companionship. We rarely argued, but we rarely laughed together, either. Our conversations revolved around the kids, bills, and work, with little room left for anything deeper. We had become more like roommates than lovers. I didn't know how to fix it, or even if it could be fixed. And so, I threw myself into my work. Teaching had always been my passion, and I found fulfillment in helping my students discover the beauty of literature, the power of words. My classroom became my sanctuary, a place where I could forget, for a little while, the emptiness I felt at home. But then Jason came into my life, and everything changed. Chapter 2. The Spark. Jason was one of my senior students, and from the very beginning, I could tell there was something special about him. He was quiet, reserved, but with a sharp mind and a natural talent for writing. His essays were thoughtful, deeply personal, and often left me surprised by the depth of emotion he was able to convey. He stood out among his peers, not just because of his academic abilities, but because of the way he carried himself, mature, thoughtful, with a quiet intensity that drew me in. It started innocently enough. I noticed that Jason often stayed behind after class, lingering at his desk while the other students filed out. I assumed he had questions about the material or needed help with his assignments, so I would take a few extra minutes to talk with him. At first, our conversations were strictly academic, focused on his work and his plans for the future. But as time went on, they began to shift, becoming more personal. I learned that Jason came from a difficult background. His parents were divorced, and he lived with his mother, who struggled to make ends meet. He was determined to succeed, to escape the circumstances he had grown up in, and he saw his writing as a way to do that. I admired his drive, his determination, and I wanted to help him in any way I could. I told myself that it was my duty as a teacher to support my students, especially one as talented as Jason. But the truth was, I enjoyed our conversations more than I should have. Jason had a way of making me feel seen, understood, in a way that I hadn't felt in years. He looked at me with a kind of admiration that I hadn't experienced since my early days with David. It was intoxicating, and I found myself looking forward to the time I spent with him more and more. One afternoon, after the rest of the students had left, Jason asked me if he could talk to me about something that had been on his mind. I nodded, motioning for him to sit down. "Mrs. Sara," he began, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me. You're the only teacher who really believes in me." His words touched me more deeply than I expected. "Jason, you're an incredibly talented writer," I said, smiling at him. "You have a gift, and it's my job to help you develop it. But I believe in you because you've earned it. You work hard, and you're passionate about what you do. That's something special." He looked down at his hands, a small smile playing on his lips. "I don't know where I'd be without your support," he said quietly. "I guess I just wanted you to know that." For a moment, we sat in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken emotion. I could feel the tension, the intensity of his gaze, and it made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. I quickly pushed the feeling aside, reminding myself that I was his teacher, that this was just a moment of gratitude from a student to a mentor. But the way Jason looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to see right through me, left me feeling unsettled. "Thank you, Jason," I finally said, breaking the silence. "That means a lot to me." He nodded, but the look in his eyes lingered in my mind long after he left the classroom that day. Chapter 3. Crossing the Line. The weeks that followed were a blur. Jason continued to stay after class, and our conversations became more frequent, more personal. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone in years, sharing things about my life, my marriage, that I had never intended to. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt good to have someone to talk to, someone who seemed to genuinely care about what I had to say. It was a rainy afternoon when everything changed. The sky was dark, and the sound of rain against the windows created a cocoon of intimacy in my classroom. Jason and I were sitting across from each other, going over one of his essays, when he suddenly looked up at me, his expression serious. "Sara," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I think about you all the time." The use of my first name caught me off guard, and I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest.
Jason, I started, but he interrupted me.
I know this is wrong, but I can't help how I feel, he continued, his eyes locked on mine. You were more than just a teacher to me. You're everything. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew what he was saying, what he was feeling, and it terrified me. But at the same time, a part of me, a part I had been trying to suppress, felt the same way. I tried to tell myself that this was just a crush, that he was young and confused, but the truth was, I had crossed a line long before this moment. I had allowed myself to become too close to him, to let my guard down, and now I was paying the price. Jason, this isn't appropriate, I said, trying to inject some firmness into my voice. I'm your teacher, and you're my student. We can't. This can't happen. But even as I said the words, I could feel my resolve slipping. Jason reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and the touch sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was as if all the emotions I had been trying to keep at bay, the loneliness, the desire, the need to feel wanted, came rushing to the surface all at once. I want you, Sara. I've never wanted anything more in my life. His words hung in the air between us, charged with a dangerous intensity. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with the implications of what he was saying, of what was about to happen. Everything in me screamed to stop this before it went any further, to remind him, and myself, that this was wrong on so many levels. But there was another part of me, a part that had been starved of attention and affection for so long, that wanted to give in, to feel something, anything, that could break the numbness that had settled over my life. Before I could respond, Jason leaned in, closing the distance between us. His lips met mine in a hesitant kiss, soft and searching. I should have pulled away, should have stopped it before it could go any further, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself kissing him back, my hands reaching up to cup his face as the kiss deepened. It was as if a floodgate had opened. Years of repressed emotions, of loneliness, of yearning, came rushing out all at once. The kiss was both tender and desperate, filled with a longing that I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, so terribly wrong, but in that moment, it felt right. It felt like I was finally alive again, like I had been jolted awake from a long, suffocating sleep. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our faces flushed with the intensity of what had just happened. Jason's eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and excitement, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just transpired. Sara, he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. I'm sorry, No, I interrupted, my voice trembling. Don't apologize, Jason. This was my fault too. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of what we had just done settling heavily between us. I knew that this was a turning point, that there was no going back from this. We had crossed a line, and our relationship would never be the same again. But even as the guilt began to creep in, a part of me couldn't deny the thrill of it, the rush of adrenaline that came with doing something so forbidden, so taboo. I had been sleepwalking through my life for so long, and now, for the first time in years, I felt awake, alive. We shouldn't have done that, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. This can't happen again, Jason. It's wrong, and it's not fair to you. He looked at me with a mixture of hurt and determination. But I don't care, Sara. I know it's wrong, but I don't care. I want to be with you, even if it's just in secret. I shook my head, trying to summon the strength to do the right thing. Jason, you don't understand. This isn't just about us. There are consequences, serious consequences, if anyone finds out. You have your whole life ahead of you, and I'm. You're what? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I'm your teacher, I said, the reality of our situation crashing down on me. And I'm married, Jason. I have a family. This can't happen. But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow, like a flimsy excuse that neither of us really believed. The truth was, I wanted him just as much as he wanted me, and the thought of ending things before they had even begun felt like a punch to the gut. Jason reached out and took my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. Please, Sara. I know this is complicated, but I can't walk away from this. From you. Not now. I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the raw emotion that mirrored my own. And in that moment, I made a decision, one that I knew I would regret, but that I couldn't bring myself to turn away from. All right, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But we have to be careful. No one can know about this, Jason. No one. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I promise. I won't let anyone find out. And with that, we sealed our fate. Chapter 4, The Double Life. From that day forward, Jason and I began a secret affair, one that we both knew was wrong but couldn't bring ourselves to stop. It was as if we were living in two different worlds, one where I was a wife, a mother, and a teacher, and another where I was a woman who had rediscovered passion, desire, and the intoxicating thrill of being wanted. We were careful, so careful, to keep our relationship hidden. We met in secluded places, far away from the prying eyes of the school or the town. I made excuses to stay late at work, telling David that I had papers to grade or meetings to attend. He never questioned me, never suspected that anything was amiss. Our marriage had become so routine, so devoid of intimacy, that my absences barely registered with him. Jason and I would sneak off to motels in neighboring towns, places where no one would recognize us. The anonymity of these encounters only added to the thrill, the sense of doing something forbidden and dangerous. Every time we were together, it was as if the rest of the world disappeared, leaving just the two of us in our own little bubble. But as the weeks turned into months, the pressure of living a double life began to take its toll. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, fearing that someone would see us together, that our secret would be exposed. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound, every unfamiliar face. My nerves were frayed, and it became harder and harder to keep up the facade of normalcy at home. At school, I went out of my way to avoid suspicion. I stopped spending extra time with Jason during school hours, limiting our interactions to what was absolutely necessary. I didn't want anyone to notice the change in our relationship, to pick up on the subtle cues that something was different. But despite my efforts, I could feel the weight of our secret pressing down on me, making it harder to concentrate, to focus on my job. And then there was David. My guilt over what I was doing to him, to our marriage, gnawed at me constantly. Every time I looked at him, I felt a pang of shame, knowing that I was betraying the man who had loved and supported me for so many years. But even as the guilt grew, so did my feelings for Jason. I was caught in a web of conflicting emotions, desire, guilt, love, and shame, and I didn't know how to untangle myself from it. The nights I spent with Jason were passionate, intense, filled with a kind of desperate need that I hadn't felt in years. But the moments after, when we would lie together in the dark, were often tinged with a bittersweet sadness. I knew that what we were doing was wrong, that it couldn't last, but I couldn't bring myself to end it. Jason made me feel alive, made me feel things I hadn't felt in so long, and I wasn't ready to give that up. But as our affair continued, I began to realize that we couldn't keep going like this forever. The walls were closing in, and I knew that eventually, something would have to give. It started with small things, little slips that hinted at the unraveling of our carefully constructed secret. A forgotten text message left open on my phone, a lingering glance exchanged at school, or a hurried exit from a parking lot where we'd stolen a few minutes together. Each time, my heart would race, the fear of discovery creeping in, but somehow, we managed to keep the truth hidden. At home, the strain was becoming impossible to ignore. David began to notice my growing distance. He would ask if something was wrong, if I was tired or stressed, and each time, I would brush him off with a forced smile, assuring him that everything was fine. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the worry etched into his face as he tried to reach out to me, only to find that I was slipping further away. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, David approached me in the kitchen, his expression unusually serious. "Sara, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. My heart sank, panic rising in my chest. I forced myself to stay composed, to keep my hands steady as I dried the dishes. "Sure, what's on your mind?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I've noticed that you've been distant lately. You're always tired, you're not yourself. I'm worried about you, Sara. Is there something going on that you're not telling me?" I felt a lump form in my throat. This was it, the moment when everything could come crashing down. I wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden myself of the guilt that had been eating away at me for months. But the thought of hurting him, of destroying our family, was too much to bear. "I'm just stressed with work," I lied, my voice trembling slightly. "It's been a rough semester, and I've been feeling overwhelmed. I'm sorry if I've been distant, David. It's not you, I promise." He studied my face, his eyes searching mine for something, anything, that would confirm or dispel his suspicions. After a long moment, he sighed and nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "But if there's ever anything you need to talk about, I'm here. I love you, Sara." "I love you too," I whispered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. That night, as I lay in bed next to David, the weight of my betrayal pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. The lies, the deception, it was tearing me apart, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. A few weeks later, the cracks in our secret finally began to widen. It happened on a Friday afternoon, after school had let out for the weekend. Jason and I had arranged to meet at a small motel just outside of town, our usual rendezvous spot. I had told David that I needed to stay late to prepare for an upcoming parent-teacher conference, and he had accepted my excuse without question. We were careful, as always, making sure that no one saw us as we entered the motel. But as we settled into the room, the unease that had been building within me for weeks finally reached its breaking point. I couldn't do this anymore. The guilt, the lies, the constant fear of being caught, it was all too much. "Jason," I said, my voice shaking as I sat on the edge of the bed. "We need to talk." He looked at me, concern flashing across his face. "What's wrong, Sara? Did something happen?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. What we're doing. It's wrong. We can't keep going like this. It's tearing me apart." His expression darkened, and he moved closer to me, taking my hands in his. Sara, please don't do this. I can't lose you. I love you. His words were like a knife to my heart. I loved him too, more than I had ever thought possible. But I knew that our love was built on a foundation of lies, and it couldn't last. No matter how much I wanted to be with him, the reality of our situation was inescapable. I love you too, Jason, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. But this isn't sustainable. We're going to get caught, and when we do, it's going to destroy both of us. I can't live like this anymore. He shook his head, his grip tightening on my hands. We'll be careful, Sara. We can make this work, I know we can. But deep down, we both knew that wasn't true. The cracks had already started to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. As we sat there in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us, the sound of a phone vibrating on the nightstand broke the tension. I looked over, my heart skipping a beat when I saw that it was my phone. David was calling. I felt a cold rush of panic as I reached for the phone, my hands trembling. I knew I had to answer, but the thought of speaking to him while I was sitting in a motel room with Jason filled me with dread. Hello? I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Sara, where are you? David's voice was filled with concern, and I could hear the strain in his tone. I'm still at school, I lied, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to stay late to finish up some work. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could feel the tension building. Sara, I'm at the school. Your car's not here. Where are you really? The blood drained from my face as his words sank in. He knew. Somehow, he had found out, and there was no escaping it now. I stammered, my mind racing as I tried to come up with an explanation, but nothing came. Sara, please don't lie to me, David said, his voice breaking. Just tell me the truth. Tears streamed down my face as the reality of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. There was no way out of this. The lies, the deception, it was all over. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, David. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when David finally spoke again, his voice was filled with a pain that cut me to the core. I'll be home when you get there, he said quietly. We need to talk. The call ended, leaving me sitting in the motel room with Jason, my world crumbling around me. I had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastation I felt in that moment. Jason reached out to comfort me, but I pulled away, standing up from the bed and grabbing my things. I have to go, I said, my voice shaking. This is over. He looked at me, desperation in his eyes. Sara, please don't do this. We can figure this out. I love you. But I knew it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I'm sorry, Jason, I said, my voice filled with sorrow. I have to go. I left the motel room without looking back, the weight of my actions crushing me with every step I took. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing as I tried to prepare myself for the inevitable confrontation with David. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a long moment, trying to summon the courage to face him. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. David was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes red and puffy. The sight of him broke my heart all over again. Sara, he said, his voice trembling. How long? The question hung in the air, and I knew there was no point in lying anymore. A few months, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He closed his eyes, as if the admission physically pained him. Why, Sara? Why did you do this? The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, and I sank into a chair, burying my face in my hands. I don't know, I sobbed. I was lonely, and I made a terrible mistake. I'm so sorry, David. He didn't say anything for a long time, and the silence was unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but I could hear the deep hurt beneath the surface. I loved you, Sara. I thought we had something special. But now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. His words cut me to the core, and I realized that I had destroyed not just my marriage, but the trust and love that had once held us together. There was no easy fix for this, no way to undo the damage I had caused. I understand, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. And I don't blame you. I've hurt you in the worst possible way, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. David looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that broke my heart. I don't know what happens next, Sara. But I need time to think. I need to figure out if I can move past this, or if it's too much. The uncertainty in his voice was devastating, but I knew I had no right to ask for anything more. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with the consequences. I'll give you all the time you need, I said quietly. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He nodded, but didn't say anything else. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I knew that our marriage would never be the same. Whether we could rebuild what we had lost was uncertain, but I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. As I sat there, I realized that the thrill of the affair, the excitement that had once consumed me, had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The reality was far more painful, and the price I'd paid was far too high. In the end, I had lost more than I had ever imagined. And as I faced the uncertain future, the only thing I could do was try to pick up the pieces of my shattered life and hope that, somehow, I could find a way to move forward. Epilogue. Months passed, and the fallout from my affair with Jason continued to ripple through my life. David and I entered counseling, trying to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It was a slow, painful process, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. There were days when I wondered if we would ever truly heal, or if the damage was too great to overcome. Jason, too, had to face the consequences of our actions. He transferred to another school, far away from the town where our affair had taken place. We had no contact after that final day in the motel, and though I missed him, I knew that it was for the best. Our relationship had been a mistake, a tragic, impulsive decision that had cost us both dearly. Over time, I began to confront the underlying issues that had led me down such a destructive path. My dissatisfaction with my life, my marriage, and myself had created a void that I had tried to fill with something illicit and forbidden. But in the end, it had only left me more empty and broken than before. David and I continued to work on our marriage, but it was a slow, painful process. We both knew that the scars of my betrayal would never fully heal, but we were committed to trying. There were good days and bad days, moments of hope and moments of despair. But through it all, we held on to the possibility that we could find our way back to each other. As for me, I had to learn to live with the choices I had made, to confront the woman I had become and find a way to forgive myself. It was a journey that I was still on, and one that I knew would take time. But I was determined to learn from my mistakes, to rebuild my life and my marriage on a foundation of honesty and trust.